Today we're going to be watching a video by Hello Future Me called Magic Systems Should Be Weirder. So, for those who are not familiar with my main channel content, if you're watching on the highlights channel, do check the main channel down in the description. I do a lot of media analysis. That's kind of my thing. I review visual novels and video games and stuff, and I talk a lot about writing. That is something I always really enjoy. And one of the things about me is that a lot of my knowledge of writing has come from just experience and doing the analysis itself. However, it's not all experience is how I got my current knowledge base. I also did watch a number of videos about the subject. I watch people talk about writing. And also, the videos about writing do help me learn about what the terms are for the things I'm talking about, because sometimes I'll describe a concept and not know what it's called. Videos like this can help. So, Hello Future Me is a channel that talks primarily about writing and world building and stuff like that. I've been watching him for a long time, haven't watched any of his videos in a while, but I do enjoy his content quite a lot. I feel like I have learned a lot from his videos, even if I don't necessarily agree with every single thing he ever says. But I just kind of want to get a chance to talk a little bit more about writing in general. This is a bit of an older video. I was going to watch a more recent one, but for those watching on the highlights channel, look at the last two videos I uploaded. Those were all done in the same stream, so I am a little tired. I would rather watch an 18-minute video than a 40-minute video. So we're going to watch Magic Systems Should Be Weirder, and I also do have a lot of things to say about Magic Systems in general. I like Magic Systems a lot. I love hard Magic Systems. They're fun. They're great. Fantasy is awesome. I'm excited to see what he has to say. And for those watching on stream, the link will be in the chat right now. And for those watching on the highlights channel, the link will be in the description. Please do give Hello Future Me some support. Not just for the fact that he's enabling this video to exist right now, but because I really do enjoy his content. I think he makes me think a lot about writing. It's great. So yeah, let's just give it a watch. Just a quick reminder that you're watching the highlights channel right now. If you want to catch these streams live or want to check out my more high-effort analytical content, consider checking out the main channel linked in the description.
Fantasy is full of worlds where people believe in magic, who use magic, like Graham the Wizard who likes cats. People accept magic as an indisputable fact, which is interesting because for most of human history this has also been the case, but often not the way we like to portray it in fantasy.
Well, I mean, a big reason for that is that in fantasy, the magic is often actually real and provable. There are some stories where the magic is not necessarily believed, or where it's not understood. But generally that's a big important distinction, because in the real world, as far as we know, magic does not exist. But in fantasy, it does. So it's important.
I talk about writing and world building in fantasy because it's my job. I wrote a bunch of books on it, and you can actually pick these up at the link down below if you like these videos and you want to learn more. Or you can...
I have not read his books, so I can't necessarily endorse them, but, you know, if anybody in the comments has, please let me know. Let me know if they're any good.
Scan the QR code on screen right now. It's pretty cool. I get to sponsor my videos with my stuff because of you. In fantasy, we can get so fixated on magic as a power system that we can forget about it as a social phenomenon.
That is true to some extent, although I will say, as somebody who likes hard magic systems a lot, one of the things that seems to go hand in hand with a hard magic system is not just how it works, but how it affects the lives of the people within that world. I mean, a good example is I read a lot of, I really like Brent Weeks as a writer. I think he's excellent, and he loves hard magic systems. His two series are Night Angel and Lightbringer. And I'll talk about Lightbringer specifically, which, by the way, if you have not read either of those trilogies, no, the Night Angel is a trilogy, Lightbringer is 5 books. Both of those well worth a read, well worth buying the books at full price, highly recommend them. The thing with Lightbringer is, you know, not just how the magic works, but the social impact is kind of one of the core elements of that story, where the whole point is that the magic system is tied into a theology where, you know, the world itself is theocratic, where the central religion, which is loosely based on the Vatican, they kind of are interwoven with the magic system, and they treat the magic as kind of coming from their god, and they kind of rule the world through the religion. And there's also political structures intertwined with all of that. And that's, as much as the plot is very interesting, there's like a conflict going on. A lot of it is also just examining how that all functions. So I don't necessarily agree that it's not a thing people think of, because I think with hard magic in particular, that's often a very key thing that writers do think about. But I will agree when it comes to softer magic systems, where it's just kind of a thing that exists, and a lot of writers are more interested in the plot than in really figuring out how the world changes as a result of magic.
As a way people think. Like, let me ask you a question. Is it magic to use garlic to ward off evil spirits? Kinda, but not really. People believed garlic could ward off blood-sucking mosquitoes, so why not blood-sucking spirits? The ancient Greeks thought maybe magnets had souls in them because they could move things around. And mercury? I mean, come on, that's gotta have some kind of power, and I'm sure we can figure it out by drinking it as many different ways as possible. For most of human history,
people
amulets
used to
were
like their
widely
poison.
regarded as methods of healing and protection, but they weren't really thought of as magical. And then there's gemstones like hematite, bloodstone, red jasper, which all had some kind of essence of blood in them.
Well, I will also just kind of give a tiny, tiny bit of pushback, where a lot of times we can see patterns in things, not really understand how they work, but still try to apply what we see to our real world. Like, for example, things like garlic and like honey. One thing about them is they do actually have some sort of healing properties. There are things they can do, like honey is antiseptic. So there are medicinal uses of honey. Before germ theory, you might not necessarily know why they actually can help with certain things. You just kind of know that they do. And whether or not you can actually explain the mechanisms, or even if you think it's magic, doesn't really matter, since you're essentially just applying your knowledge of the world as best as you can with limited information. So, I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily say the connection is as clear as he's making it.
Concentrated, and so people thought they could naturally help with the flow of blood by grinding it down, and guess what? Drinking it.
Yeah, and you can also come to incorrect conclusions as well. That is a very common thing, especially once certain pseudoscientific theories started cropping up, because let's not forget, we know that how illness generally works today, how usually, at least infective illnesses, come from, microbes, bacteria, or viruses that get into your system and replicate and cause problems and all that. Back in the day, there were kind of two prevailing theories. There were humors and miasma. Humors were basically saying, hey, you got the wrong juices inside you, or at least the wrong balance of juices. And that's why bloodletting was a thing. They kind of thought certain illnesses were caused by, yep, you got too much blood, we're going to take some of it out of you. Which, was not necessarily a good thing most of the time. But there was also cases of miasma where they thought that the air itself was what got you sick, and that tainted air would spread disease. And if you've seen the Plague Doctor mask, it had those really long noses. The reason for that is because they would actually stuff a bunch of shit of like perfumes and stuff like that and aromatic substances inside the nose of those masks, so that they would essentially filter out the diseased air from the Black Death, which, interestingly enough, the filtering aspect of things, the fact that they prevented things from getting breathed right onto them, probably did actually help prevent the disease a little bit. But it was based on a flawed theory, so again, just because people do have these understanding of things and can sometimes hit the nail on the head, like with honey having antiseptic qualities, sometimes they fuck it up as well.
It was a pure metal, maybe associated with the moon, and so had other properties which were kind of associated with those. It's not as simple as saying magic was just primitive science, even though it did overlap with that. People historically felt they were surrounded by things they couldn't necessarily touch or see, but they could definitely feel, that they knew were real. Think about plague, or the power of time and rotting and rust, temperature fluctuations. And so they believed lots of...
and the plague is that he kind of glanced over it, but the plague in particular was such a big deal. Because it's one of those things where before antibiotics, because, the Black Death, the Black Plague, the bubonic plague, or the Black Death, same thing. They both still exist today. People do catch them. You just don't really hear about it, and that's because nowadays we have antibiotics. If you catch it and then you get treated with antibiotics, you're probably making it through. However, back in when it was the going across the world, the bubonic plague was pretty much death sentence. I think something like 95% of people who caught it ended up dying, and then ended up killing something like half of the world, half of the known world at the time. So, it was not just a thing that was there. It was something where you probably knew people who had died from it. You were probably actively scared of catching it yourself, and it fundamentally changed the fabric of society. So he's really understating how big a deal the Black Death was at the time.
Things like garlic and mercury and magnets had invisible properties just as much as visible ones too. That might sound like a very soft magic system to us, but it's also a fundamentally different way of viewing the world. They had all these ideas about the natural qualities of things in the world around them. Trees, metals, colors, gems, often applying real things incorrectly where they didn't apply. So kinda magic, but kinda not. We can call this messy magical belief, and it was everywhere in human history. It varied intensely from place to place, even person to person, and yet magic in our fantasy worlds is often really quite simple in comparison. Not only in the shape our magic systems themselves take, but in the kinds of magic people believe in our worlds. And that's because world building a magic system from the ground up, where you, the author, understand how your world works, and you're looking at how these powers are going to impact your politics and economy and warfare, is a very different thing from normal people attempting to infer an understanding of their world from observations without much help. Basically, magic is complicated. A lot of fantasy worlds have a strangely clear line between what people think of as magic and not magic, which wasn't particularly clear historically, but more fundamentally, they often lack a lot of this messy magical belief, which is weird because not only would this kind of magical belief still be around even if magic was real, but it'd arguably be even more common and pervasive. Like, let's
Okay, so I kind of get what he's saying, where kind of this vaguely magical stuff doesn't always exist in stories that have magic in them. Although I think it might even be a little bit more complicated than he's making it out to be, because I think one of the difficulties when it comes to this subject in general is that we live in a world without provable magic. So whenever we see a fictional world with magic, that is so starkly different from our experience that it stands out to us. Would somebody who lives in a world where magic is just a normal, accepted part of life, just like the fucking wind, or just like gravity, would they see magic in everything the way we as an outsider see it? I don't know that there's a definitive answer to that question. But if we look at, for example, I know those of you who are watching on the Highlights channel, I've talked a lot about Mushoku Tensei on the streams, where one of the whole core elements of Mushoku Tensei's world building is that most of what is different about that world is the result of magic, or more specifically mana, which is kind of the energy that fuels magic, where monsters are just animals that have been mutated by magic. Labyrinths are caves that have been mutated by magic, that kind of thing. We, as an outsider, can see how this thing that doesn't exist only exists because of magical interference. But if you lived in that world where magic has always existed, would you necessarily make those connections? I'm not sure that's necessarily the case. Because while he's, I think, poignantly arguing that magic does... people would see magic throughout the universe in ways that we don't really think of as writers today, I think there's also instances where things that are very clearly the result of magic would not necessarily be viewed as such, and would just be viewed as another facet of the world that is just how things are. So I think, when it comes to fiction writing and world building specifically, it is such a complicated discussion. There are so many things that go into it, and there's a non-zero amount of guesswork as well.
Take a very clearly defined, simple, well-understood elemental magic system in bending from Avatar: The Last Airbender. This is a world where you can be born with the ability to manipulate the elements with martial arts moves. And here's a question. Would fire divination, real or not, be considered firebending? Fire divination is the practice of reading messages in flames and ashes and burnt wood, interpreting signs and giving guidance and prophecies. It's exactly the kind of superstition which would attach itself to firebending. In fact, it even appears in the show in the episode The Fortune Teller, but it's portrayed as this totally separate thing. The fact that firebending is...
I don't know. That's an actually interesting question because... Okay, so the way... I mean, because it's been a while since I've watched Avatar, but I really like Avatar. I think it's great. But one of the things I've noticed is that Avatar, the bending element, involved actual physical manipulation. And there were definitely cultural markers of the various elements, like the Earth Kingdom had even like architecture. Like the Water Kingdoms were in the North and South Pole. They were, very clearly inspired by the Inuit, but they also had like igloos and stuff, and that they actually made their structures out of the water, essentially, of the snow, of the ice, whereas the Earth Kingdom had structures made out of rock and stone and bricks. And the air nomads lived up in the sky, and they that's how they all did their thing. So I feel like the bending element specifically is about the manipulation of the element in a physical sense, but that there are still cultural markers of how that type of bending is viewed culturally. So I don't think that the fire divination would necessarily be viewed as fire bending, but it would kind of be almost like the cousin of fire bending. That would be my guess.
Is real in this world and does have these sort of soft spiritual powers means this sort of belief would thrive. Or what about...
Well, there's also the fact that they do have kind of a loosely... I mean, there is a spirituality in Avatar, a religion of sorts. There are certain things that would be considered religious beliefs in the real world that are just provably true in the Avatar world, like the cycle of reincarnation with the Avatar, how it's essentially the same soul that's being reborn again and again and again into different cultures throughout history. And then also they have the spirit world, which is where they have the spirits, which have very similar to like the Shinto kami. So it's hard to say that it's just a magic system thing, because there actually do seem to be religious things going on in the world building of Avatar as well. Because I will say it's another very important thing in world building, where religion does fundamentally change society no matter where you look. But at the same time, it changes things in a different way when the religion in your fictional world is provably true, or if has elements of actual truth to it. Whereas in the real world, as far as whatever we can actually observe and demonstrate and prove, religious beliefs are subjective. Not necessarily the case in fiction. In this case, a lot of the religious elements of the world are provably true. There is a spirit realm that Aang has actually traveled to. There are things that actually do affect the real world, and there are things that people say that are actually existent in that world. That is an important distinction. I'm not sure he's actually acknowledging that. Let me move back a little bit.
Soft spiritual powers means this sort of belief would thrive. Or what about the idea that scattering ashes across your floor might hold water spirits at bay? Or think about essential oils. Would that attach itself to waterbending? It's a kind of healing water, supposedly, and waterbending has healing powers. It's a common kind of messy magical belief, even today when people are widely educated, which is not the case for a ton of fantasy worlds, which are low-tech, low education, low information, and they're made
usually yes, but there's so many different varieties of fantasy, and nowadays there's a lot of blends of fantasy and other stuff. Like, if you look at steampunk, a lot of steampunk has fantasy elements included within it. Like, a classic example is Dishonored, the Dishonored series. It is a steampunk setting where the protagonist is given magical powers by what is essentially a god. So, I don't know. I get that he's kind of, for the sake of his video, portraying this in a very direct and straightforward way. I think it is a lot more complicated, and there is always going to be exceptions, and I think there's going to be things... Basically, every eventuality, if it doesn't already exist, it's going to exist at some point. So, I mean, while it is true that a lot of fantasy is kind of the stereotypical medieval European fantasy, there's also countless examples of fantasy that is not that.
genuinely be spirits from another realm interfering with the physical world who hate garlic. A lot of this is going to depend on how well your magic is understood, but all these sorts of beliefs are going to naturally sprout from the magic that is real.
And yeah, that's also an important distinction of how well it's understood in the world. If they really understand how it works, that's going to change how they interact with magic and how that affects the wider culture. Also, what is important is how the author, how the writer treats magic in its entirety. Like, generally the two types of magic that can exist. Well, I would say there's kind of three types of magic. There's the magic as a force of nature approach to things, and that's like where a lot of hard magic systems come in. So like, again, look at something like Brent Weeks, where he has his Lightbringer series, where some people are born with the ability to create substances out of the color spectrum. So if they have a certain color going of light that is available to them, they can draw upon that to create some sort of substance that they can do things with. Or if you look at like Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn, some people are born with the ability to metabolize certain metals that can allow them to do things that can fuel certain powers of theirs. That's how that works. So magic as a force of nature is one way of doing things. Another way of doing things is magic as a religious thing. It's some divine power, the whatever creator god usually is how it goes, is exerting their will onto the world, or there's some sort of holy magic, like the cleric is empowered by the divine to be able to do whatever it is they do. That's another approach to magic. And then there's kind of a man-made approach to magic, which is kind of a little bit like more sci-fi than anything, but it does share a lot of elements with fantasy. So there are kind of three different approaches to magic. They each have their own implications, and I think that is a very, very, very important distinction that affects how a writer should handle magic and how their world would be affected by that magic.
Pseudoscience sprouts from real science and blurs the line between fact and fiction. People will bring messy magical belief everywhere we can, especially if the world is full of other things that we don't understand, like
fucking magnets, how do they work?
Like, why does mint make your mouth feel cold, and why does drinking mercury make you feel bad? And all this is going to be especially the case if you have a really soft magic system with kind of vague and unpredictable rules and limits and powers, but definitely real, giving just much more room for this kind of messy magical belief.
And that is true. I do understand and generally agree with what he's saying here. I do think another important thing, just however, is that we do need to understand normalization is a big factor, where magic is always to us going to seem weird and crazy because we live in a world that, as far as we know, does not have magic. Characters in a world with magic do not have that same perspective. They have a perspective of, oh, magic exists, it's just another thing that exists. Because imagine how fucking weird gravity would look to a society reading about us where gravity doesn't exist. To us, we can't even comprehend a world without gravity, because gravity is just a law of physics. It is how the world, how the universe works. It is so normal to us that the idea of it not being around is weird. That's how I imagine a lot of people in fantasy settings think about magic, if it's a pervasive force in the world. And I will say, I do agree what he's saying generally, but that I think is something that he's almost kind of imagining, like, what if our world had magic applied to it, and not how does this community think of magic when it's just another force in the world? Because again, they might not even think of anything unique about it. They might think, oh yeah, magic is just like gravity. It's just a thing that happens. I don't know.
You might be thinking, well, a really hard magic system is probably going to be immune to a lot of this.
Not necessarily.
But no, let's take Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn.
I was just talking about that. I mean, to be fair, Mistborn is one of the most well-known hard magic systems out there. That's the one I was talking about earlier, where you eat certain metals and those act as the fuel for certain magical powers depending on the metal you eat, and certain people have abilities with certain types of metal. That's how that kind of works.
Series. A world where ingesting certain metals can give you powers, like 10 heightens your senses to a superhuman level. A very hard magic system. But I gotta ask you, what about mercury? It's about as close to a magic metal we have. It definitely impacts the brain, and people in this world know that most elementers can only digest one metal anyway. So maybe mercury is just a really soft and subtle version of this.
Yeah, I'll also say that the magic system in Mistborn is very incomplete. I think so. The way Brandon Sanderson approaches his writing is very different from the way most writers do writing, because Brandon Sanderson does, he writes books for a living, and he treats it like a 9 to 5 job where he spends 8 hours a day writing a book, and then when he's done, he clocks out, and that's the end of his workday. He has a very methodical way of writing that's not kind of this creative push. And while that's very good for his output, because he releases a fuck ton of books, but one of the downsides of that is that I feel like he kind of wrote Mistborn, the series, and I like Mistborn. I read the whole thing. I enjoyed the series immensely. It was kind of clear that he didn't have everything fully figured out by the time he finished the series, because there was just kind of this implication. It's like, oh, there might be people able to digest metals that we haven't really thought about, and that, they've just kind of been, their existence has kind of been suppressed. So they said, oh, by the way, these other like 7 metals, there might be people who can digest them and do stuff with them. Good luck figuring it out to the kind of the next person who's going to be like, who, if there was a sequel series, that character would be the protagonist. That's kind of how that works. I'm not going into details, partly because I don't want to spoil anyone, and partly because I don't really remember myself. But so while Mistborn is a great example for hard magics and how that all impacts things, and I get what the comparison he's trying to make, there's also the fact that I feel like Mistborn's magic system wasn't fully fleshed out. I think there are things about it that even Sanderson wasn't entirely, that he didn't have entirely nailed down.
It's an easy leap to make. Likewise, unknowledgeable peasants might naturally come to the belief that having a tin amulet might give you better hearing. I mean, it is absolutely a property of tin in this world. But I didn't see a lot of this messy kind of magical belief in the story. We think a lot about how the rules, limits, and costs of our magic system would change our...
Another factor with that is, and again, this is just kind of based on my recollection, it's been years since I've read Mistborn. If I'm remembering correctly, the idea of allomancy was primarily limited to like the upper society, where it was, while there were people in the lower societies who could do allomancy, it was generally believed to kind of be a noble thing that most peasants believed was inaccessible to them. And even if it was accessible to them, they didn't necessarily have a teacher for it. So the fact that the general populace might not have this strong understanding or this strong cultural familiarity with allomancy might also be a symptom of that.
World building, but rarely about what people would project onto the rules, limits, and costs themselves. The messy magical belief which would muddy our understanding of how the magic system works, but also make your world feel more alive and deep and lived in, because people are messy where our neat little magic systems often aren't. If your magic system relied on burning precious animal materials like ivory or bird feathers or rhino horn, then of course people are going to take that and apply it to stag antlers and shark teeth.
Yeah.
I almost want to encourage you to have kind of like 2 sets of rules for your magic system. The ones which work, and the ones which people believe work, with all this messy magical belief, and to play with the ambiguity between them.
That is an interesting idea. I will say I do think it really depends on how your magic system works. Because again, there's just so much freedom when you're creating a magic system. You can make it work in any way you want to. And then everything else is kind of, what are the implications of that? And I also do think just, yeah, I do agree with what he's saying, broadly speaking. I think there's just so many potential exceptions that it's hard to really think of. And also it does matter just, I think a big thing is how people actually utilize the magic. Is it something you're born with? If so, how rare is it to be born with it? Are there only certain categories of people who are born with it? How does that all work? Or like, I think another Brent Weeks example with the Night Angel trilogy. One thing he mentions is that different cultures specialize in different kinds of magic, not necessarily because of any real reason, any hard reason. It's just because, hey, this one area has a strong cultural connection with fire. So if you were born with the ability to do like earth magic, you might actually be kind of shunned. They might say, oh, you're a shame on our family. Or if you're a healing community who specializes in healing magic and you have an affinity for fire magic, you might be seen as like a devil and be cast out. So, again, there are people who do take these types of things into consideration. So, but yeah, it's an interesting conversation. Again, I think my main point of criticism overall is that he's speaking in more absolute terms than I think is justifiable given the circumstances. I think it is so much more subjective, so much more vague than he's making it out to be, but I also understand that if you're making a video essay, you have to have a solid thesis.
We get to see a little bit of this in A Song of Ice and Fire, in the one chapter from Melisandre's point of view, one of the only characters in the entire series that we do actually know definitely does have some kind of real magic. 3 tallow candles burned upon her windowsill to keep the terrors of the night at bay. 4 more flickered beside her, 2 either side. The fire must never ever be allowed to go out.
Yeah, and that's another thing, is that the issue with A Song of Ice and Fire is that the story is still very incomplete. Because, I mean, we all know Game of Thrones has finished, but that was based on the books by George R.R. Martin. And most of A Song of Ice and Fire is relatively magic-free. Magic has a very minimal impact, aside from specific practitioners of magic and like the dragons with Daenerys. So, but most of what the story is actually just mundane things where magic has very little impact on society as a whole. And people who are familiar with magic, who are able to utilize magic, are often viewed as like scary or outsiders. They're kind of shunned. They're kind of looked upon with fear, that kind of thing. And magic only kind of really just started to make an impact on the story towards the end of the most recent book, which I say most recent, but the book came out when I was a fucking freshman in high school, which was like 15 years ago almost. So yeah, that's a whole thing. So magic has not really been thoroughly explored in A Song of Ice and Fire at this point. And also, let's be completely real here. George R.R. Martin is never fucking finishing the series. I do think it's probable that after he dies, whoever inherits his IP is probably going to disregard his wishes and get somebody to finish it anyway. Because I know George R. R. Martin does not want that to happen, but it's probably going to happen anyway. But he also just seems to just have lost interest in finishing the story. But so I will have to acknowledge that, is that, yeah, I understand what point he's going to be making here, but also A Song of Ice and Fire is incomplete. This magic is not fleshed out, and it probably never will be.
The Red Priestess closed her eyes and said a prayer, then opened them once more to face the hearthfire. Visions danced before her, gold and scarlet, flickering, forming and melting and dissolving into one another, shapes strange and terrifying and seductive. It was an art. R'hllor spoke to his chosen ones through blessed fire, in a language of ash and cinder and twisting flame that only a god could truly grasp. She had a smoke for truth, a smoke for lust, a smoke for fear, and the thick black smoke that could kill a man outright. My spells should suffice. She was stronger at the wall, even stronger than in a shy. Melisandre's magic is real. There is actual power in fire, but we get to see in this little passage and a few others that there's all these other practices associated with it that she's kind of latched onto, that the followers have projected onto it.
There's also a factor that I think, again, it's been so long since I've read A Song of Ice and Fire, and it's one of those ones where, you know, it does leave a bad taste in my mouth just because George R.R. Martin refuses to actually finish the books. But the thing I always kind of took from Melisandre, because a lot of what A Song of Ice and Fire was is actually inspired by real things. Like, the plot itself is pretty strongly inspired, and he's been open about this, that it's by the War of the Roses, which took place in Europe a long time ago. That's kind of what served as the foundation for what A Song of Ice and Fire was. Melisandre always kind of reminded me of like the ancient Greek oracles. Like, the famous one was the Oracle of Delphi, where the way they kind of did things is that a lot of times they were either, and even shamans in general, were either people who actually were like mentally ill, who had like schizophrenia or something like that. They view them as having like visions from the gods, or they would ingest hallucinogenic substances. Like, it was, I know one theory is that some of the Greek oracles were sitting in chambers where just there were gases that were coming from the earth that had hallucinogenic properties, and the visions they saw were interpreted as prophecies. That's kind of the vibe I got from Melisandre, where that's kind of what they were going for, where yes, she does have magical abilities, but her brain is also just kind of, she's kind of gone off the deep end a little bit, and that, you know, her experience with power has kind of put her on the precipice of madness, and that she was kind of dealing with powers that a mortal mind couldn't necessarily comprehend.
Like the placement of candles, the use of powders, the fire must never go out, which people may have come to believe around this actually functional magic, but we don't really know if it really helps. And all of this is to say nothing of the messy magic people would believe in completely separate to your magic system, like garlic and gemstones. And by the way, I have 3 whole chapters on hard magic and soft magic and how they intersect with world building and storytelling in volume 1, while volume 2 goes into hard and soft world building and how magic plays into all of that, which is really relevant here, I feel. I feel like I'm reading some fantasy stories.
Yeah, those books don't look very long. Maybe at some point I'll read them and give my thoughts on them. I don't know, though. Maybe.
I don't want to name names here, but they go, you know, this is magic in our world. This is our magic system. And this is really the only magic people believe in. They might have different, you know, interpretations of the magic from culture to culture, but this is the magic that there is. And that is kind of strange, because people are going to have lots of beliefs outside that. Like, you know, Vikings thought they were imbuing their swords with the spirits of the dead by burning the bones of their fallen in the fires they're using to make swords. But guess what? They were making an early...
Oh, hard and soft world building? I'm guessing it's just like specific... I mean, I know the difference between hard and soft magic. Hard magic is magic that actually has like a basis to it that is explainable, that you can kind of pinpoint everything together, like it's a force of nature and it has specific rules, whereas soft magic is kind of just vague and you don't necessarily know how it functions. It might not have a solid function to it, might just exist. Like, you know, a classical soft magic system is like Lord of the Rings, where it's very mystical. I imagine world building is kind of the same deal, where hard world building is you can really just kind of connect the dots and pinpoint how everything came to be. And soft world building is more like, this is just how it is. That's my guess, based on my knowledge of other things, like, again, soft and hard magic. Or hard and soft sci-fi is also a thing, where you can have science fiction where everything is explained. Even if the scientific principles don't actually make sense, you can kind of come to the understanding of how it works in context. Or there might just be, hey, we've created this mystical technological bullshit, and that's soft sci-fi. So that's where I'm thinking his hard and soft world building distinction comes from.
Kind of steal by infusing their iron with carbon. People will still believe that sort of thing. And like wearing amulets or garlic, they might not even really think of it as magic. But
yeah, and I think this also, I'll go back to my previous idea, is what if it's just something that's so intrinsic to the world they don't even think of it as a unique thing, like gravity? We don't really have a whole lot of varied cultural beliefs about gravity, because it's just, we know how it is. We get pulled downward. That's just how it is. Now, once you studied it, we kind of understood that matter attracts matter, and that the reason we get pulled downward is because the Earth is a really fucking huge piece of matter that pulls everything smaller to it. And that we interpret that as a downward force. But we don't really have these crazy spiritual beliefs of how the magic of gravity works. It actually took some revelation to realize, oh shit, this actually is a force that exists. Why does it exist? So magic could exist in these worlds in that capacity as well. I don't know.
Just using the invisible properties of the world around them. Because the reality is, a lot of magic really comes down to humanity's evolutionary Pokemon superpower, pattern recognition. We look for things which look kind of similar to each other. We might call it natural sympathy. Like, oh hey, bloodstone looks a little bit like blood, so maybe we could use that to ward off internal bleeding if we, guess what, drink it. Bloodstone does not taste good. So yeah, invent a magic system. Look at how it's going to impact your world building, but invent a magical culture that goes beyond your powers and limits and rules and whatever.
And I do generally agree with what he's saying. I would caution against going too hard into that mindset because, again, we're operating from a perspective of a culture that does not provably have any magic whatsoever. So to us, magic is going to stick out like a sore thumb, whereas within the culture, magic might just be another normal part of society where it's just not something that they take note of. So it might not influence like every single facet of the world, like, you know, like Harry Potter, where they do everything magically. It might just be, it's just, again, to them, magic is just like the wind. It's a thing that exists. It's a thing that's going to impact some things, but it's not going to impact everything. And we may or may not have other cultural importance surrounding magic. Just like some cultures have importance surrounding the wind, or surrounding trees, or surrounding rocks, or surrounding gravity. It's gonna vary.
You know what? All of this gets even messier because the term magic itself is honestly a bit of a loaded term historically. We often use the term magic in fantasy world building as a catch-all for any otherworldly powers. Tell the future, healing wounds, shoot chickens with lightning bolts.
Stop right there, criminal scum!
But historically, the label magic was often a classification of legitimacy. We get a little bit of this in some stories where characters will like insist that their powers aren't magic.
It's not magic, it's water bending.
Magic being here used as a term to dismiss it. But like, let me ask you a question. Is prayer magic? Kinda, but we don't call it that. Saying I prayed for my home feels like a very different thing to saying...
I mean, it's gonna depend on your... Okay, I would say, just if I'm being pedantic, if you believe prayer works, it's not that prayer itself it's magic, it's that you're asking your God to do magic for you. So, again, I would argue that it's not magic in itself, it's essentially a call to do magic.
With this incantation over my homestead, I invoke the power of gods!
Scholarship has generally started to move away from using the term magic because a lot of what old manuscripts describe as magic, which I've been reading for this video, were often just another person's religion or science. And historically, the line between what magic and religion and science was pretty blurry and all about perspective anyway.
Well, again, there's also another concept. I don't know if he's going to go into it or not, but there is a sphere of thought when it comes to writing, is that any technology, if sufficiently advanced, is indistinguishable from magic. So, like, again, like, imagine showing somebody AI from the 1700s. They're going to think that it's magic. And in the same way, if you see magic from 500 years into the future, I mean, the technology from 500 years in the future, it's going to look like magic to us. So there is even some blurring of that in writing where, again, something could just be interpreted as magic from our perspective, even though it's a lot more complicated than that.
But in this way, the term magic can be an expression of power dynamics. Colonial powers would often label like indigenous rituals as, quote, magic. But again, it's not as simple as that. Think about the garlic. People at the time might have been hanging this outside their doors, not because it's like their religion or anything, but because, you know, that's what garlic does. It wards off spirits. But if someone was unfamiliar with that, they might point at it and go, "It's a witch! Magic!" Like, of course it's not going to ward off spirits. You need asparagus to do that. Sometimes the label was about calling people fraudulent, and there's been some extensive writing now, which I've been reading for this video, and you can see references, that the term was often to describe inappropriate religious ritual. What I mean here is a woman might do the exact same real religious ritual as a man, but it might be inappropriate for her to do it because of her sex, and so they labeled that as magic, which itself did lead to the common idea that like women's magic is evil and wrong, and I'm sure that had no historical consequences whatsoever. But even the term superstition, which we tend to take as meaning like non-scientific and irrational, was actually originally used to describe basically bad or excessive religious practice.
Okay, that is an interesting thing to note. Like, it is... I am curious as to how he's going to tie this back into writing, because I will say this is honestly a bit of a linguistic thing more than anything else, although... Okay, now that I'm looking at it, looking at these guys' faces is fucking funny. Like, these people are smiling like idiots. This guy is clearly not too thrilled. This guy seems a little bit too interested in what's going on. I don't know. This guy's just kind of crashing out right here. I shouldn't be getting sidetracked like this, but yeah, because it does sound like he's talking a little bit about linguistics more so than actual, because words do change over time. That's just a natural consequence of language being used.
Like, not necessarily having no power, not being fraudulent, but being morally questionable in how it's done. Like in the Roman period, there was a conflict between public polis religion in the cities and private domestic rituals in households, which were sometimes seen as competing with the public stuff. Think government orchestrated rituals versus privately praying in your home. And as this conflict escalated, people started to label these unregulated domestic rituals as magic because they were associated with being politically and socially subversive. What I'm getting at here is we often go, this
Roman
is the
society
magic
was also
system. We
weird.
draw lines through it based on the powers and rules and limits. This is evocation, and this is divination, and this is necromancy. When sometimes what's classed as magic or not magic or something else entirely, or legitimate or illegitimate or natural or unnatural, which rules are really rules or which costs are really costs, these can be social classifications, sociological lines which are going to impact how the magic system itself is interpreted and used, as well as any of that messy magical belief which is naturally going to sprout from it. It's about how magic is understood as a concept in itself within your world, and I think that goes a step beyond a lot of what people do when they're world-building magic. And thinking about how certain practices weren't necessarily thought of as magic, but just dealing with the natural properties of the world, sometimes in fantasy, what is magic to one person might just be the natural abilities of another. This actually shows up in Lord of the Rings when Sam looks at Galadriel's magic mirror. She says, "For this is what your folk would call magic, I believe, though I do not understand clearly what they mean, and they also seem to use the same word for the deceits of the enemy. But this, if you will, is the magic of Galadriel. Did you not say that you wish to see elf magic?" Because for elves, their art, their craft isn't like magical, it's just what they do.
Yeah, and I do think a lot of what is classified as magic in the scope of fantasy is usually defined by how it differs from our world. Even stuff that is not like traditionally called magic, like if you look at Warhammer 40k, the warp stuff, they do have, essentially sorcerers the psychers who draw upon their connection to the warp, which does technically have a kind of a sci-fi element to it, but it is ultimately magic. But, the identifier is how the warp is different in the 40k universe compared to the real world. And I think that's how a lot of like Lord of the Rings stuff, where it's like, oh, this might not be magic to these people, but it's magic in the way that it differs from our world. So I think that's probably the most consistent definition I can really give of what qualifies as magic in a fictional setting.
Unbreakable and glowing in the dark, that's not like a magical quality to them, it's just how they make things. This is again thinking about a magic not just as like systems of power, but as social phenomenons, even within the world. And I think this may bring us closer to the fantastical worlds we create. I started thinking about this topic after I was reading the Lacnunga, which is this like old Anglo-Saxon manuscript. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but it was going through all these really interesting healing recipes and medicines and stuff like that. And the line between kind of like medicine and magic and science and stuff was really blurry and really interesting to get an insight into that culture.
Well, I mean, that's not that surprising to me, because even real world medicine, a lot of it is almost discovered by accident. Like if you think of penicillin, which is kind of the precursor to modern antibiotics, which changed the face of medicine entirely. I mean, penicillin started as just some mold that happened to grow. Turns out it had antibiotic properties, so it got cultivated, and they eventually used that to build future antibiotics and just learn how that all works. But I mean, yeah, it wasn't something that somebody intentionally developed. It's just a thing that happened to come about spontaneously.
I've made world building videos on how like empires rise and work and fall and how revolutions really play out and death, how that impacts your world. I've got videos on hard and soft world building and magic systems, and those videos are great, but I can never be as in-depth as I would love to be with these discussions on YouTube. With YouTube, I've got to be thinking about the algorithm and thumbnails and all this other stuff. And that is fundamentally why I wrote the On Writing and World Building series, so that I could take all of these discussions and put them into these easier to read and reference books and go deeper and wider with better analysis and examples and way more exclusive content in here that I'm ever able to do on YouTube.
Yeah, I mean, I will, to be perfectly fair, there are probably ways he could use that information that he put in the books. There are probably ways he can put that into his videos. That being said, I get the idea of that he can structure it the way he wants. That's not necessarily geared towards, algorithmic trends, because that is actually a factor that content creators have to consider, is that some topics are just harder to get out there than others. And that's just a consideration you have to make. I mean, there's a reason that I don't really talk about concepts all that often when I'm discussing fiction and writing and stuff like that. There's a reason I talk about specific pieces of media, because those are more likely to get in somebody's algorithm. There's more likely for somebody to search for them. Even though there are ways for me to do that concept sometimes. But even then, it's usually framed in the context of discussing a particular piece of fiction or a collection of fiction. Though, again, there are exceptions. Like, I think I made my video about the inclusion of rape in fiction. I thought that one is more conceptual, even though it uses specific examples as the framework. But again, there's a reason most of my stuff is about specific pieces of media, not overriding writing concepts.
Seriously, I wrote these books thinking, 500 people were going to get them. And then I was astounded because we've now sold like 120,000 copies, something like that.
Wow,
Each of the volumes.
That's actually crazy. 120,000. Like, he's a successful YouTuber. Like, he's got over 1 million subscribers, but like 120,000 copies, that's impressive, honestly. Like, he's probably made a healthy amount of money off of that.
Stand entirely on their own, covering different topics. But if you only want to get one of them, I recommend getting the third one. I think it's the best. I think it's got the most as well. And there will be another volume coming one day. Of course, you can get all of them as audiobooks, paperbacks, ebooks, all you like. If you like these discussions, but you want to go deeper, then these are the next step. And thank you so much, because, this is the whole other side of my career, writing.
Yeah, and I will say I've not read these books myself. I'm curious about checking them out, seeing if they're any good. Because, again, I do like the theories behind writing. That's kind of what my main channel is underneath the surface. Like, yeah, I'm talking on the surface. I'm talking about things like, the visual novels, video games, and, explicit stuff like the hentai, the eroge, that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, I'm talking about how the writers communicate things to the audience. Might be interesting to see more of what this guy has to say about these topics in like a less algorithmic setting. So if they're not too expensive, I might end up picking up a copy of these.
Publishing. You can read my fiction, by the way, at the links down below, or you can pick up my book, Catalog for the End of Humanity, which has some pretty cool world building in it as well. And
yeah, that is also another thing where I will also acknowledge that just because somebody knows a lot about writing doesn't necessarily make them a good writer. So I'd be curious to see if the stuff he talks about, he can actually apply it to his own fiction. Because, again, that's something like, for example, I talk a lot about writing. I talk a lot about fiction. I'm not necessarily the best writer out there. I haven't done any serious writing in a long time. And I've learned from experience that what I'm actually good at is like flash fiction, not larger interconnected stories, even though those are the ones I love to talk about and I love to discuss. I love to think about. Like, if I wrote something like Mushoku Tensei, it would probably suck. But, so yeah. Knowledge doesn't always translate to ability, but sometimes it does, or it can inform ability.
Also interesting magic. Or if you want to join the community more deeply, I've got my Patreon. You can join our writing workshops. There's the Discord over there. We're always talking about writing and world building, all that sort of stuff. I'd love for you to join us. Stay nerdy, and I'll see you in the future.
Okay. I wonder what the next 2 minutes of his video is. Oh, it's just, okay, it's his Patreon crawl. Okay, makes sense. So yeah, ultimately, I'll pause it there. I don't need to shill his patrons for him. But yeah, overall, that was a good video. I had some areas where I wanted to push back, But Hello Future Me has always provided interesting perspectives on things. It makes me think about writing in a slightly different way. And as somebody who really likes fiction in general and how it's constructed, I do always appreciate having somebody who clearly, even if I don't agree with everything he says, he clearly knows his shit and he makes me think, which I think is very important because I think my biggest amount of learning, especially when it comes to fiction, comes from me being forced to think about things. I learn actually a lot when I'm working on videos, when I'm analyzing something, putting things together. That's when I know things. And yes, MR, as my official non-medical medical advice, 100% you need to drink mercury. That is how that happens. That will bring about the answer to all of your problems. For legal reasons, that's a joke. But yeah, overall, again, I haven't watched Hello Future Me in a while, but I've always liked his videos. He always makes me think. I always learn a lot when I think, and I definitely appreciate that. So, for those watching on stream, link is going to be in the chat. For those watching on the highlights channel, link will be in the description. Please do support the original creator. I always appreciate the original creators here, and you should too, because they make for some interesting content for you to watch, and this video would not exist without Hello Future Me right now. So, that's going to have this be. For those watching on the highlights channel, thank you for stopping by. I will see you in a couple days with a new video.